Soundstripe.
Hello and welcome to the fourth episode of Demystifying Politics, the show where we help young people engage with politics and the world around them. On our topics today, firstly, we will cover the COVID crisis in India. Next, we will talk about Nazanin Zhagari Ratcliffe and her case in Iran. And lastly, we'll talk about Boris Johnson's flat refurbishments, which has caused huge scandal all across the country. Finally, for our bonus questions, we will ask, is liberal democracy the only way in the 21st century? So we'll start off with COVID in India, and I'll just introduce it. So in India, we are seeing an unprecedented crisis like no other. 3,689 people dead today, a new record. 400,000 new cases. And what's important to note is that this is a huge underestimate. I cannot tell you how huge of an underestimate this is. For example, deaths are only being counted in hospitals when there are so many stories of people dying in the hallways, dying outside of hospitals, unable to even reach hospitals. Moreover, the government has put a cap on the number of tests state governments can do in the day on the day in a day, so we don't know the true scale of the cases. Now, what will be important to note, not only from this crisis, how bad the loss of life and the true scale of it is a few things. Firstly, how much will the virus mutate and how badly will this affect our current vaccination program when it comes to the rest of the world? Will Narendra Modi himself be punished for this crisis? For example, recently in West Bengal, a couple of days ago, the election results came in and Modi was handed a setback in a state he hoped to capture. So will this crisis have political ramifications for a man that has seemed till now politically untouchable? Nathan, what do you think?
It's always important to remember that India is a massive country, one of the most densely populated in the world, well over 1 billion. So it's not unexpected that they would have one of the most dangerous COVID situations in the world. However, this is, as you said, unprecedented. The first wave was, I think it's fair to say, dealt with at least to a decent degree, but this second wave has actually skyrocketed. After the first wave, restrictions came down, people went to the cinema, there were religious events, there were public gatherings, and some politicians actually falsely claimed that the virus had been defeated. Well, obviously, we see that it's not. That's actually coming from a epidemiologist, Chandrakant Laharaya, and he said that in some of the most badly hit states, like Delhi and Maharashtra, community transmission was so rampant that there have been several localized waves, which to give, as I said before, because India is a large country, you're seeing waves, national quote unquote size waves in smaller areas. And there will be political ramifications for this. You said Modi suffered setbacks in West Bengal, but also he's going to suffer on the national scale, because many will remember that earlier in the pandemic, while India was seeming to be doing better, he was exporting lots of vaccines to places like Britain in an effort to boost India and his own geopolitical standing. Now it is coming back to bite them because they are very quickly running out of vaccines, and people are dying, unfortunately. So there is likely to be an increase in anti-Modi sentiment after this.
Yeah, and I think what you mentioned, another thing that'll come back to bite him actually is the triumphant statements he made towards the end of the first wave. Like, they've defeated Corona, they've done it, the BJP's done it, they've done what no Western country could do. And he was like claiming, oh, everyone thought we'd be bad, but we were actually quite good. I think that's the thing that'll most come back to hurt him. And as you said, even I thought from the beginning of the pandemic, it's going to be bad in India, just because of the sheer population density and the crowding in most of the major cities. So India was always going to have it tough, but I don't think anyone saw the scale and the ferocity and honestly the pace of this crisis that is engulfing India at the moment. And just as I said, to put into context, how many more people are dying than we actually think. Everyone I know who's Indian, everyone I know has a relative that is ill with COVID, myself included. Everyone I know. It's crazy. Like everyone has COVID in some way or another. The crisis is unbelievable. Oxygen cylinders are like gold dust now in India. They've replaced gold basically. I think the Indian government might start backing their currency with oxygen cylinders instead of gold, because it is like so expensive. There are people profiting off the pandemic, unfortunately, charging exorbitant prices for remdesivir, for oxygen, hoarding these crucial supplies that people need. And so, what you're seeing from this crisis is like you're seeing just generally from the pandemic as a whole, the good side and the bad side of humanity. The bad side being these profiteers who are sucking the blood out of India by hoarding these essential supplies, and then also at the same time charging exorbitant prices. But you're also seeing like temples and different community centers offering services for free to the poor. So you're seeing the good and the bad side um, of India and of humanity. But I think the most important thing to see from this crisis is that COVID is not over yet, and the moment we think we've won, the virus comes back. And I think the worst thing that will come out of this, not only apart from the loss of life, will be the new mutants. And scientists are saying that they haven't even got an idea of the amount of mutations that have now gone through the cycle in India. Because you can imagine if it's going around like millions and millions of people, the virus is going to keep mutating. That was the biggest fear with India. And now, if some vaccine resistant strain emerges, we could be in trouble. We could be, as much as I hate to say it, and I really don't want to say this, we could be locked down again. Um, and
It's also
yeah,
very important to note that the fact that India is now having this situation where they have to hoard vaccines is going to affect everyone around the world. Currently, about 1 in 5 global COVID vaccines are being manufactured in India, and they were previously exporting many of them. So it's not so countries like Britain, the US, that previously have had very successful vaccination campaigns are also going to see the drawbacks of India's new effort to keep vaccines at home.
yeah, and I think that we've seen a lot of vaccine nationalism generally from the EU, from Britain, from basically every country, and now India, which was one of the most kind countries, one would say, when it comes to giving vaccines to others. Now we're going to see them drawn into that same uh, trap. What else do you think?
I do. In when you combine this with the Kishan Lives Matter movement, the perceived anti-farmer bill, this is definitely going to be detrimental to Modi's image as a as an Indian strongman, as a man as a sort of quasi one nation conservative who's holding. I hate to use a British term here, but a one nation conservative who's holding the country together, because this virus is now it is completely national. Whereas the first wave was primarily limited to big cities like Delhi and Mumbai, this second wave is now even in rural areas. And as you said before, it is affecting absolutely everybody. So yeah, this will definitely be detrimental to Modi's image, and it'll be interesting to see whether this gives China a leg up in projecting strength in Asia and the rest of the world.
Yeah, I think the last thing I'll say about this is I do think this scandal is different. And I think it genuinely will hurt Modi, because before we've seen so many scandals and everyone said, oh, this time Modi's really met his match. But every time he comes out like a phoenix from the ashes, victorious, untouched, barely even with a scratch on his face. The reason I think this time it's different is A, he cannot blame it on like partisan troublemakers. So for the NCAA protest or the Farmers Bill protest, he blamed it on foreign nationals, on troublemakers, on communists, whatnot. A COVID crisis in India, you can't blame that on anyone but yourself, firstly. Secondly, I know lots of relatives who support Modi. I don't myself, but I know people who support Modi, but they are very critical of him for this crisis. So I do think this scandal is different and he will be hurt. by this, and also particularly because he was so triumphant at the end of the first wave, and it's really coming back to bite him. Do you think we should move on?
Next topic.
Yep.
Now, it's been a very busy news week, but one topic I would particularly like to speak about is the continued imprisonment of Nazanin Zhagari Ratcliffe. Now, Zhagari Ratcliffe was born in Tehran, in Iran, prior to the revolution, but in about a decade and a half ago, she moved to the UK and got married to a British national and is now a British citizen. When she returned to Tehran to teach, she was imprisoned by the Iranian government on suspicions of teaching anti-Iran propaganda to children and was therefore imprisoned under such charges. She was scheduled to be released. However, due to an infamous blunder from Boris Johnson, who was then Foreign Secretary, she was imprisoned further, and her sentence was renewed earlier this week. Now, Zhagari Ratcliffe's husband says that she's being kept essentially as a hostage because the British government was no longer paying back debts to Iran from the late 1970s. So I think the question here is going to be, should we negotiate with a regime like Iran, or should we be taking more aggressive action in dealing with them? Dev, what do you think?
I think we, as a country now, not as a country, sorry, let me rephrase that. I think the Conservative government for too long has tried the hardline stance that you mentioned. We don't negotiate with terrorist countries. We're not going to negotiate with Iran. We're not going to engage. And guess what? For 4 or 5 years, a daughter is missing her mother, a husband is missing his wife, and we've gotten nowhere. I think the government now, as some news reports suggest, are going to look to repay that debt, and Zhagari Ratcliffe will be back. I don't condone the actions of Iran. I think it's a horrific what they've done with Nazanin Zhagari Ratcliffe. I think Iran as a whole, its government is probably one of the most repugnant, if not the most repugnant, along with North Korea. One of the most repugnant regimes in the world when it comes to human rights. But I think if the UK government had earlier on started to pay back that 400 million pounds, we wouldn't be in the situation, and a father would not, a mother won't be losing her daughter in Iran, in an Iranian prison. A whole family will not be mourning. She's been on hunger strikes. She's had horrific health. She's had lots of mental health issues. I think it's really just time to just pay back the money. Anyways, we're isolating Iran when it comes to sanctions on many other fronts. So yeah, I think the government should pay back the money and let Zhagari Ratcliffe go home.
I think yes. I think the aim for Britain is not just this conservative. Well, it has to be the aim of this conservative government because they've been in power since 2010, but also for future governments, it has to be an aim to sort of disassociate from any relation with any sort of conflict in the region. British involvement in the Middle East obviously goes back a century and really even further back. And I cannot really say that it's been entirely productive. Now, in this case, our association with Iran has and will cost the taxpayer more money, and has caused the breakup of British families. So in the future, to prevent things like this happening, to prevent British nationals from being arrested, imprisoned, and used as leverage overseas, we need to cut off connections with Iran, but also surrounding countries like Saudi Arabia. I think that's the only real solution, because we can pay back the debts and that will resolve this one issue of Zhagari Ratcliffe being imprisoned, but that will not prevent Brits from being imprisoned under further incredulous charges. So yes, the aim has to be disassociation.
Yeah, I think also we're going to see a rise in these sorts of like political prisoners, because Iran basically previously would get a lot of its frozen assets or its debt repaid through the JCPOA, which is the Iran nuclear deal. And that was how they'd get back their money and grow their economy. But now that the JCPOA has been long dead, they've still got a lot of frozen money, frozen assets. and the way that they think they're going to get it back now is taking political prisoners, taking citizens of the US, the UK, um, imprisoning them on bogus charges, and hoping that the governments will finally buckle. And as it seems from the news reports today, the US and the UK governments are going to buckle. And yeah.
Okay, so this is an analysis from Caroline Hawley, who is the BBC's diplomatic correspondent. And Hawley drew parallels between this situation and the situation of British Australian academic Kylie Moore Gilbert. Now, this is directly from a BBC article. Last November, it, referring to the Iranian regime, released the British academic Kylie Moore Gilbert, who'd been sentenced to 10 years for spying. That was in exchange for 3 Iranian prisoners in Thailand, 2 of whom had been convicted of a bomb plot. And back in early 2016, when Iran's nuclear agreement came into force, Iran freed an American journalist and Jason Rezaian in a prisoner swap. It's no coincidence Mr. Ratcliffe, that's obviously being Nazanin's husband, believes that this verdict has come just as negotiations are taking place to revive the deal, the Iran nuclear deal. So it seems that there is an argument that diplomacy between the 2 countries, that a normalization of relations can fix this. I do think that this normalization, quote unquote, of relations has to be temporary. I do not think that Britain, as a liberal democracy, can commit itself to openly associating with a theocratic government that regularly oppresses its citizens. Any normalization of relations has to be limited to we won't take any of your people as prisoners. We won't bomb your country. It can never be a we welcome you with open arms. I completely reject any sort of deal which attempts to bring Iran on side as an ally in the region.
Yeah, and I think what you said is actually really important because I think that our relationship with countries around the world should be normal. It should just be like, we should be amicable basically with the majority of countries around the world. I don't think the US and the UK should be actively pursuing any sort of like hostile actions towards particular governments. I think, for example, normalization of relations with Cuba or with Iran, it's fine, but I agree that it should be limited to, yeah, we promise we won't bomb you. We'll stop like our sanctions on medicine or whatever, and we'll kind of let you be. And but yeah, I don't think we should be, encouraging investment in Iran or welcoming them in or start singing praises of the supreme leader of Iran. And I think with North Korea, I think we take a slightly different approach because because of the nature of how oppressive their regime is. I don't think normalization is even possible with a country like North Korea. But I do think it's possible with Iran because Iran is slightly more open than North Korea. But yeah, I actually agree with you when you say that we shouldn't go over the top when it comes to normalization when it comes to with Iran.
Regardless of whatever policy decisions that the UK government pursues in regards to Iran, it's clear that Nazanin needs to come home. Now, on to our next story. In a controversy that has seen the government accused of elitism and corruption, we now have another money-related scandal. So, prime ministers in the UK have an annual allowance of £30,000 towards maintaining their Downing Street home, but there are speculations that the renovation pursued by Boris Johnson and his partner Carrie Symonds cost up to £200,000. Now, it is said that in an interview with the Times that Carrie Symonds described Downing Street. Well, this is 11 Downing Street, where Boris Johnson and Carrie actually live, described it as a quote unquote John Lewis nightmare. This has obviously led to accusations of elitism, that they believe they themselves to be above a shop like John Lewis. And obviously they are now being accused of using taxpayer money exorbitantly to fund the renovation of their private home. What do you think the political ramifications will be of this scandal, I guess?
Well, first of all, when it comes to John Lewis, I have no idea what she has against John Lewis. Am I the only person that thinks it's a pretty good high-end store?
Yeah,
Secondly,
I was confused when I saw that as well. I
yeah,
didn't
no,
think that that was
I
a
can understand someone saying like a little nightmare or something like, or making fun of Tesco's. But I thought John Lewis, Marks and Spencer, they're actually pretty, middle class, upper middle. They're not some sort of like, well, anyways, that's quite beside the point. Um, I think the scandal itself, um, I was I was gonna take a normal take on this and just say, it is. I wouldn't call it particularly scandalous if I'm going to be perfectly honest. There's some people with some manufactured outrage on social media, like this is the worst thing a government has done in the past 50 years. Like, and yeah, okay, redecorating your flat. I mean, if I'm going to be perfectly honest, I don't really care. But I saw a really interesting article in The Economist where they took a different view on it, which is that actually why do we have the prime minister of our country living in a glorified flat? Like, so what the Economist said is, for example, the US, the president in his free time has acres of land, a bowling alley, a cinema, a private jet, tennis courts, lounge area, spa, retreats, etc., because they know how demanding the job is of running, a major superpower. Britain, yes, we're not an empire anymore, but Britain is still a superpower, and being the prime minister of a superpower does take its toll. And what happens is, what the Economist article argued was that you get to the end of your day's work, and you have to end up going back to a flat where you have to do the house cleaning yourself, where you have to do the laundry, you do basically the tasks most people have to do on a daily basis, and except all you get is there's a cleaner that comes around every once in a while to your room. And I think that the reason we as a country has done that is because we want our prime ministers to be normal. We don't want them. We say, okay, the pomp and the glamour, that can be the queen. But the prime minister, he has to be normal. He doesn't have an exorbitant salary, doesn't live in some big flat, some big house, and he has to represent Britain. But I think that or what the Economist article argued was that's not the view we should be taking. Why is the Queen living in an extremely expensive house with all the pomp and the glamour, and every expense of
yeah, I
hers is
really
being paid
think
for?
that Downing Street is a relic of the old role of the Prime Minister.
Exactly.
Officially, the Queen is the head of state, and the Prime Minister is supposed to take on a secondary role as head of government. But really, since Blair became the first quote unquote presidential Prime Minister, the role of the Prime Minister has really shot up in terms of relevance and their duties.
It shot up basically since the Second World War. The monarch has been extremely irrelevant, if we're going to be honest with ourselves.
Yeah, the Prime Minister is no longer
Yeah.
simply an advisor to the monarch regnant. The Prime Minister is now the center of the show. People attribute successes in public life or failures in public life either to the government or to his or her government, to the Prime Minister and his or her government. So we're really being dishonest with ourselves when we say the Prime Minister is simply an advisor to the monarch. No, we should start having higher expectations of our prime ministers, and that heightened expectations might, as you say, come with increased privileges like a larger home. Now, I'm unsure as to whether I really want to be enriching a political class that I don't think has really served Britons in the past 10 years. But I do think if we can guarantee that politicians will be more dutiful, then I am not inherently opposed to a more luxurious residence.
Yeah, and I don't necessarily think we need to have some sort of like we need to turn it into the president, but I do think that the leader of the country should be slightly better taken care of. Um, and you know, let's be honest with ourselves. What was the scandal for Boris Johnson that he wanted like what was the exact number again? Was it 40,000, 400,000 that he was getting on?
200,000 versus 30,000.
Yeah, 200,000. So, for example, when Obama came in, he spent like $11 million on just redecorating the White House. Trump spent 10 million. These the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom lives fairly modestly. So we're gonna have a huge outrage over this. I think there are better scandals to focus on honestly, when it comes to this government. And don't worry, there's a
Yeah,
massive
particularly the Greensville Capital scandal that we had just a few
exactly.
weeks ago.
There are plenty. There's a menu list of options to choose from. I honestly, if I'm going to be perfectly honest, I think this is a bit of a non-scandal, and I think all it really shows to serve is, all it really serves to show is that we probably need a more luxurious residence for our prime ministers.
One sort of interesting ramification of this is that Boris Johnson seems invincible, completely invincible in the polls. He's actually, according to a poll conducted by The Independent, extended his lead on Keir Starmer's Labour, despite these accusations of corruption. So why do you think this is? What do you think is causing the extension of his lead over Keir Starmer?
I think that Boris Johnson has this Modi Trump like quality whereby they are just simply immune to scandals. Trump, of course, said extremely incendiary things about women, about minorities, about disabled people, about all sorts of different people, any of which a normal politician would have been down and out for, um, alongside numerous other scandals about cheating. You know, there's we can't delve into that. Modi similarly has had loads of scandals, and I think Boris Johnson has had his fair share too. And what they all share in common is their ability to brush it off. So Trump, for example, says, "Oh, fake." He says fake news, or just simply brushes it off. Like, yeah, well, Modi does brushes it off by simply being above the fray. He barely engages in the trench warfare that is domestic politics in India. He tries to be this sort of supreme, like this almost religious cult-like figure by sort of just staying above domestic politics in India. And I think what Boris Johnson does is he does a sort
Yeah,
of
has
like,
this facade of a likable fool with his
yeah, so he's like,
uncombed hair.
he roughs up his hair, he comes up, he goes, oh, you know, the British people don't really care, and he's sort of just immune to any and all scandals, really. And I think it's really interesting phenomena to see modern day politicians just unaffected by scandals that would kill the careers of most.
Now,
Sorry, just I was,
would
I
you
was
have
going to
anything?
say, just last thing before we move on to the bonus question. I was going to say, for example, Jeremy Corbyn had the anti-Semitism scandal stick to him for his whole career as leader of the opposition, and he never quite got it off because he never quite mastered the art, this Boris Johnson Trumpian art of just brushing off scandals like they mean nothing. And I think that it's interesting to see, it's just an interesting thought. Yeah.
Now, on to our final question. Is liberal democracy the answer? Throughout the Western world in the past 5 to 10 years, we have seen Brexit, we have seen the rise of Trump, we have seen the almost victory of Marie Le Pen of France. We have seen the national conservative takeover in Poland and Hungary. There seems to be a rejection of liberal democracy across the West. So we are asking, is it viable and is it the answer in the 21st century? Dev, any thoughts to begin?
I think, with liberal democracy, I think it's an interesting challenge that it faces nowadays. I think that it has faced challenges in the past, namely fascism, absolute monarchy, communism, and now sort of right, whatever you want to call it, right-wing populism, authoritarianism. It faces various challenges. I think that liberal democracy, I think I am a supporter of it. I do stand up for it. And I think with the challenges of the 21st century, I think that I still believe that a system which recognizes individual rights and democracy and the right of all people to have a say in their elected government, I think that's still a very powerful idea. And I still think the basic right to choose your own government, the basic right to your own freedom of expression and your own thoughts, I think that's still very powerful. And I think you see that, yes, there are some liberal democracies like in Hungary and Poland that have creeped towards authoritarianism. But there are also, in Hong Kong, we see protests. In Myanmar, we see protests of people yearning to be free. So I do think that the basic idea that you have your own rights, you have rights and you have the right to choose your own government. I think that is still a very powerful idea, and I think it is I think it is, the way forward.
I am of the opinion that the whim of the people, which is now in the modern era, constantly under the influence of popular media and big journalism, I do not think that is an effective tool for managing a government. In the past, you might say that's because people's interactions would have been much more authentic. They would not be carefully manufactured by Instagram echo chamber algorithms. They would not be manufactured by Hollywood or by big corporations like Fox and CNN. So their opinions would be much more relevant to day-to-day goings. However, now we know that the media relies on overblown issues to sell stories, and therefore a populace that is completely trapped within that ecosystem cannot be expected to effectively govern. Now, this is not to say that we should take them off their franchise. We need to have a serious consideration about whether liberal democracy is compatible with this sort of big journalism ecosystem where we allow news and media corporations to have this endless sway over public life. We do need to look at antitrust legislation to ensure that people have these authentic conversations with their neighbors, with people in their local communities once more. And therefore, I think that would allow their votes to be less based on whim, based on what they saw on TV, what they think national problems are, versus what national problems actually are, which they could much better learn by being active members of their local communities.
I agree with what you say. I think that the problems that liberal democracy has, the inherent side effects it has, I think that they can be managed. And I think, yeah, I do agree that the journalism ecosystem is quite toxic. I think the worst example of it is America, unfortunately, where you have companies like CNN that thrive off like making politics to sort of theater, this sort of like flashbang spectacle, when that's not what it is. It's not a house of cards. It's people sitting down trying to make their country a better place. It's not a battle between yourself. You're living in the same country. The other person, your neighbor's not your enemy. And I think that the journalist ecosystem, it thrives off an enemy. It thrives off showing someone that you should fear. In the 60s and the 70s and the 90s, that was communism, that was the Soviet Union. Once the Soviet Union collapsed, the enemy had to become other people in your country. So I think that the way we can solve this is, yes. So first of all, antitrust legislation, making sure people like Murdoch and other billionaires don't have unnecessary influence over public opinion. B, I think we should have a combination of unbiased state media. I'm not when I say state media, I say state-run media, but don't think of it with the connotations of like Iran or North Korea. Think the BBC, a bit more like impartial broadcasting network, alongside private neutral broadcasting networks, which I think we do have in the UK. I think BBC, Sky, ITV, they're all fairly neutral, and that is because we have a broadcasting regulator called Ofcom, which states and governs impartiality rules. So I think in the UK we don't have a problem as much when it comes to news organizations. I think our problem stems from the tabloids and newspapers, which are often controlled by a minority of billionaires who then proceed to stake out fortunes by spreading propaganda about immigrants and minorities and spewing hate.
That is definitely true. That is definitely true. We know that one problem with the extension of capitalism and the private mode of production to news is that bad news sells best, sensational news sells best, and therefore, and the most obvious example of this are newspapers like the Sun, big bold capital letters, an informal register of speaking, which appeals to the lowest common denomination in society, such that anyone who was previously uninformed can now has supposedly a clear idea of what the country's existential threats are, and therefore we see crises overblown uh, to enormous proportions. For example, I'm aware that last summer, with the illegal migrant crossings, we had maybe at its peak a few thousand. But if you had read the Daily Mail, you would think that it was like a total invasion and that Brighton was going to be filled with Syrian refugees when that simply wasn't the case.
Yeah, and I think the worst part about it is as you mentioned, what is essentially happening is that a handful of billionaires are indoctrinating the working class and filling them with hatred and filling them with untruths. And I think that's just toxic for our country.
Definitely so.
I think what we talked a bit about liberal democracy and some of its side effects. Do you want to talk about like alternative ways to organize society? And maybe the alternatives to liberal democracy, because I think over the past century, perhaps since World War II, it's sort of liberal democracy has had this stand in the world like it's unbeatable, like there is literally zero alternatives to do it. So, would maybe a Singaporean style of authoritarianism, um, is that a possible alternative? Is direct democracy an alternative? Is perhaps slightly less franchise, a bit more of a Republican system in the sense that, it is more in the hands of the politicians. How do you think we should organize society? And do you think there are alternatives to liberal democracy?
I have to admit, I am a big fan of the Singaporean style of government. They have a Westminster parliamentary democracy. However, since Singapore's independence, the country has been controlled by the People's Action Party. First under their leader, their founding father Lee Kuan Yew, but that's dominance has continued into the modern day. Now, just to give you some example, just to give you some idea of how instrumental this style of government has been for Singapore. When Singapore declared independence from Britain, it was a backwater colony being threatened by the powers of China that was suffering under ethnic division between the Chinese, Malay, and Indian communities that live there. But now it is one of the most advanced economies in the world, far richer per capita than the UK or the US or Australia or any Western country. And they seem to have, unlike many Western countries, reached sort of a resolution on multiracial experiments. Obviously, we've seen across the European continent lots of um, ethnic conflict with recent refugee and immigrant populations. However, that problem seemed to have been resolved on a large scale in Singapore decades ago. There's criticism that this style of government is anti-freedom of press. I think such accusations are overblown, and even so, I think that is preferable to a society that is struck by internal division and struck by poverty. I am a big fan of the Singaporean system. What are you? Do you have any contentions with the Singaporean system?
I think that Singaporean system is actually a very interesting case study because, yeah, I mean, it is a democracy because it has universal suffrage and it does, people can vote. But what's interesting to note is, of course, it has state media. Freedom of speech is pretty, it's not that free. Freedom of assembly is pretty restricted. And generally, critics of the government have been like suppressed, although not to the extent you've seen a proper like authoritarian government like North Korea. I think actually, with at least with developing countries, I think a slightly more, like a touch more authoritarian, or a touch more, strong
Heavy-handed
government
government.
is required. I think with developing countries for sure, because otherwise you're going to have a situation with a lot of countries like in Africa or with or in the Middle East where you're constantly having civil wars, you're constantly stuck with internal divisions and dissent, with elections with no real outcome. I think definitely initially with developing countries, a Singaporean system is preferable, but I think once they reach a certain level, then that should be curtailed and it should be a UK US style free liberal democracy where the citizens are then educated enough and healthy enough and well fed enough and more and comfortable enough to make the right decisions and educated decisions about who should serve them in government.
Yeah, the problem within developing countries constantly changing your leader either 4 or 5 or 8 or 10 years is that just as a country begins to develop, you take away the individual, you rip out the individuals that are the impetus for such change. That is not beneficial. We've got to remember that many of the so-called developed countries in the modern world, particularly Britain, were never really developed under this idea of universal suffrage. Obviously, Britain didn't let women vote for the first time until 1918. They didn't let working class men vote the same year. They didn't reduce the voting age to 18 until the 1960s. So it's not the case that Britain developed under universal suffrage, and therefore I think it's very privileged for Westerners to expect currently undeveloped countries to develop in a similar manner. So I do think that the Westminster style democracy that is seen in Singapore is the best way of dealing with the best way of governing a country.
I think I have to disagree with you there a bit. I think that universal suffrage is a right that should be given, however developed you are as a country. I think, yes, perhaps, restrictions on dissent or restrictions on, as long as they don't get too harsh, and restrictions on like assembly, they're not too bad. So maybe you can go slightly Singaporean in that sense. But even Singapore has universal suffrage. I think that is something that cannot be infringed upon, no matter how developed you are as a country. Do you think, lastly, do you want to speak about, like, overall, do you think liberal democracy reformed, checked? Do you think that is the way forward? Or do you think genuinely a Singaporean style of government is the way forward for countries around the world? Because you're seeing in like the US, for example, their system of government is now completely inept. You have a different party that comes in every 8 years. You have complete block in legislative bodies whereby no significant legislation is ever passed because of the filibuster, and all significant actions are either taken by the Supreme Court or by executive order. Do you think that with you're seeing like the flaws of democracy, and do you think that genuinely Singapore is going to be the way forward?
Well, in countries like the UK and the US, I think such political strife is overblown. There's lots of talk about civil wars in countries like the UK and the US. I don't think we're anywhere near that stage. However, in much younger democracies like those in Eastern Europe that have just been under Soviet oppression up until 1991, I do think a Singaporean style government might be more beneficial there, where their democracy is still very much in its infancy. They haven't had very many regular elections. I do think while I think there is reform necessary in Western countries, while I wouldn't be opposed to a sort of Singaporean government in the UK, I don't think it's necessary in the same way it is necessary in, say, Poland or Hungary.
Okay. Do you think we should end there?
I think I have a closing statement on liberal democracy, and
Yeah,
then
sure.
I will wrap up
Yeah.
overall. Francis Fukuyama, an American historian and political theorist, wrote in a similar manner to Hegel that a certain political system was the inevitable result of all of human history. Now, Hegel and Marx believed that communism was the eventual end goal of all human events. However, Fukuyama believes that liberal democracy and free market capitalism was the inevitable result of the internet and of human history in general. He believed that liberal democracy had always proved itself superior to all other systems of government. Now, liberal democracy has now entrenched itself with nuclear weapons and with large standing armies, and that has sort of enabled it to posture as superior. I don't think it's superior. I think it's greatly flawed, but I do think it is just sufficient in Western countries. Now, for a brief overview, First, we looked at the COVID situation in India and how it would affect Modi. Then we went right over to London and Tehran, looked at British-Iranian relations and the case of Nazanin Zhagari Ratcliffe. And then uh, we looked at Boris's flat renovations and his seeming invincibility in the polls. Thank you for listening. This has been Demystifying Politics, the politics for young people to get to know more about politics. Follow us on Instagram and Twitter at the same handle, Demystifying Pod on Twitter, and you can hear us every single week on your favorite podcast platform. Thank you.